The shaft yawned, a black throat swallowing the last of the Nevada sun. We were pushing deeper than any crew before, chasing a ghost vein Silas swore would make us all kings. Below, the air was already thick, tasting of dust and damp rock, even before the last timber was set. I checked my lamp, the flame a small, defiant flicker against the encroaching dark. Old Man Hemlock, his face etched like ancient stone, paused at the brink. He didn't look at us, just into the void, a shiver running through his thin frame that had nothing to do with the cool air. We'd heard the whispers, of course. Every mine had its tales, its ghosts. But this time, the mountain felt different. It felt like it was watching us go down. It was autumn of 1871, and the Comstock Lode was still spitting out silver like a drunken gambler. Virginia City hummed with the promise of it. And we, the men who burrowed into the earth, felt that hum in our bones. Our crew was a seasoned lot, though some more seasoned than others. Silas Malone, our foreman, carried the weight of it all on his broad shoulders. His late 40s showed in the deep lines around his eyes, perpetually narrowed against dust in the dim light. His jaw was set, always, a grim determination that kept us all moving. He spoke in clipped tones, giving orders, expecting them followed. No nonsense. He was fair, though, as fair as any man could be when a mountain wanted to crush you. We were a dozen men, but the core of us, the ones pushing this new, deeper shaft, were Silas, myself, Jacob Miller, young Tommy O'Connell, Bart Crumpler, Jeb Finch, and Caleb Thorne. I was in my early 30s, wiry, observant, and kept mostly to myself. My hands were calloused, strong. I'd seen enough mines to know the good ones from the bad. And this one, Silas promised, was going to be the best. Tommy O'Connell, barely out of his teens, was the youngest. His sandy blonde hair often escaped his cap, and he had a boyish, optimistic grin that felt out of place 1,000 feet underground. He talked constantly of sending money home to his widowed mother and sisters back east, of buying them a house. His dreams, simple and bright, were a stark contrast to the dust and gloom. Bart Crumpler, on the other hand, carried the mine in his very bones. Burly, with a thick, dark beard perpetually streaked with rock dust, he was in his late 40s like Silas. But where Silas had grim determination, Bart had a grimace. He was superstitious, always muttering about bad spirits and cursed rock. Most of us ignored him or joked about it, but you could see the fear, even then, flickering in his eyes like a dying lamp. Jeb Finch was our quiet strength, a towering figure built like a rock, easily in his late 30s. He worked with a quiet efficiency, always there to lend a hand, never complaining. He had a wife and 2 young boys in Virginia City, and a worn photograph of them he'd sometimes look at when he thought no one was watching. Cal Thorne, nearing 50, was the cynic. Wiry, thinning gray hair, and a perpetual skeptical look. He'd seen enough boom and bust to trust little beyond his own 2 hands. He cracked jokes, dry and sarcastic, especially when the tension built, but he was reliable, and he had a soft spot for Tommy, always looking out for the boy. We worked in shifts, the clanging of picks and the scrape of shovels echoing through the narrow passages. The air was hot, thick with the smell of rock and sweat, and the coppery tang of mineral. Our oil lamps cast dancing shadows, making the familiar walls seem to shift and breathe. Every breath was an effort in that suffocating heat. The mountain groaned around us, a constant, low rumble that became part of the background, like our own heartbeats. Silas had found it, or rather felt it. A seam, thin but promising, veering off the main lode at an impossible angle. It led deeper, further than any shaft had gone before. He called it the King's Vein, and the promise of it made the choking dust and the constant threat of collapse worthwhile. We were pushing into uncharted territory, beyond the known maps, guided only by Silas's gut and the faint glint of silver. The new shaft was a tight squeeze, It snaked downwards, barely wide enough for a man and his tools. The rock face here was different, darker, harder. It seemed to absorb the light from our lamps rather than reflect it. We were 1,000 feet down, then 1,200. The pressure was palpable, a heavy blanket that settled on your chest. It was during the first week in this new section that the first oddities began. Nothing you could put your finger on, not at first. Just a feeling. A shift. One morning after the night shift had gone up, I found my pickaxe leaned against the wrong wall. Not just a foot or two off, but on the opposite side of the narrow tunnel, almost as if someone had moved it deliberately. I knew I hadn't left it there. I was particular about my tools. I picked it up, hefted it, and placed it back where it belonged. Shrugged it off. Fatigue, maybe. Or one of the night crew playing a joke. But it wasn't like them. Later that day, Tommy swore he heard something. A faint, high-pitched scratching, he said, like stone on stone, but too regular, too deliberate. We were drilling, and the noise was considerable. I told him it was just the rock settling or the drill bit hitting a different vein of quartz. He nodded, but his eyes kept darting to the unlit passage deeper in, a branch we hadn't yet timbered. Bart, of course, was the first to give voice to it. He'd always been prone to muttering, but now it was louder. "Old spirits," he grumbled, wiping sweat from his brow with a grimy hand. "The mountains got old spirits. Don't like us digging so deep." Cal Thorne snorted. "The only spirits down here are the ones we cough up from the dust, Bart. Or the ones you drank last night." Bart just glowered, his lamp shaking a little in his hand. Old Man Hemlock, who had joined our crew for this deep push, didn't say much, as usual. But he watched. His gaunt face, with its long, unkempt white beard, was always turned towards the deeper dark. His eyes, which seemed to hold the secrets of the mountains, unblinking. He was well into his 60s, a living relic. He'd often be whittling small figures from driftwood, his gnarled hands surprisingly delicate. One afternoon, he stopped whittling, holding a small, twisted piece of cedar. He didn't look at us, just at the wood. "The mountain calls," he mumbled, his voice a low rasp. "It always calls. But this time, it is a different call, a hungry one." Silas, hearing him, just shook his head. "The mountain calls us to silver, Hemlock, nothing more." Hemlock just hummed, a low, unnerving sound. He didn't argue. He rarely did. The air, which had always been thick, now felt heavier, almost viscous. It clung to you. The familiar sounds of the mine, the rhythmic clang, the distant rumble of ore carts, the drip of water, began to be punctuated by moments of unnerving silence. Not just the quiet between shifts, but a sudden, absolute hush that would descend, swallowing all sound. In those moments, the only thing you could hear was the frantic beat of your own heart, thrumming in your ears. Then, just as suddenly, the normal sounds would return, leaving you to wonder if the silence had been real or just a trick of the mind. Weary from the constant toil and the flickering light, we pushed deeper. The rock grew wetter, seeping with cold, mineral-rich water that tasted like iron and earth. The heat, paradoxically, still radiated from the rock, damp and oppressive, making the cold spots feel even more alien when they appeared. Pockets of air, unnaturally chill, would drift past, carrying with them a faint, unsettling smell. It wasn't the dust, nor the damp rock, nor the miner's sweat. It was something else. Metallic, perhaps, or something like old damp. Earth. But wrong. Utterly, fundamentally wrong. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there, coating the back of your throat, a taste you couldn't place, couldn't shake. Silas, ever pragmatic, attributed the cold to new veins of water, the smell to decomposing timber or unknown minerals. We were going deeper than anyone had ever gone. Strange things were to be expected, but even he started to pause, listening to those silences, his brow furrowed deeper than usual. He never spoke of it, but you could see it in the way his eyes lingered on the unlit passages, in the way he checked the timbering twice. We found another anomaly, more pronounced this time. A section of newly exposed rock, smooth from the blasting, had a faint, almost invisible scratch across it. It was too high for any of us to reach without standing on something, and too thin to be a tool mark. It looked like something had just dragged a fingernail across the solid granite, leaving a faint, pale line. Jeb, towering as he was, couldn't reach it. He just stared at it, his quiet strength faltering for a moment. "Rockfall," Silas declared after examining it. "Must have been a sharp edge on a falling piece." We all looked at the perfectly smooth rock around the scratch. No sign of a rockfall. But no one argued. What else could it be? The deeper we went, the more the camaraderie, the shared jokes, the easy banter began to wear thin. The strain of the work, the oppressive heat, the suffocating darkness, and these small, unsettling details began to weigh on us. We were still a crew, still working towards that promised silver, but an invisible thread of apprehension was weaving its way through us, tightening with every foot we advanced. The mountain we knew was a beast, but this felt like something else, something watching us, waiting. And we, chasing the king's vein, were pushing right into its maw. The small scratch, which Silas had dismissed as rockfall, was only the beginning. Within days, we found more. Not just scratches, these were gouges, deep, as if something had pressed its full weight against the rock and raked with something harder than steel. They appeared on freshly exposed faces, sometimes 10 feet up, too high for any man to reach, even Jeb, who could almost touch the ceiling of the tighter passages without stretching. They were too wide for a pickaxe, too long for any natural fracture. The marks were deliberate. Silas ran a calloused finger over one, his face unreadable in the lamplight. He didn't offer an explanation this time, just a tightening of the jaw. Cal Thorne just shook his head, a dry cough escaping him. Even his jokes had started to thin out. The cold spots became more frequent too, not just drifts, but pockets of absolute dead chill that would cling to the air in certain passages, defying the oppressive heat of the Lode. They felt wrong, as if the air itself had died there. And with them, the smell. The sour metallic scent, like old blood mixed with damp earth, became more frequent, stronger now. It was no longer subtle. It coated the back of your throat, a taste that lingered, a smell that permeated the very rock. Old Man Hemlock didn't need to see the gouges or feel the cold. He just stood in the mouth of the deeper shaft, his gnarled hands gripping his whittling wood, not carving. His eyes, the color of faded denim, were fixed on the darkness. "It leaves its mark," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "The mountain spirit, it leaves its mark when it claims its territory." Bart Crumpler, who had been listening, dropped his shovel with a clang that echoed too loudly in the unnerving silence that had suddenly descended. He stared at Hemlock, his face pale beneath the grime. "Spirit?" Bart stammered, his voice trembling. "What kind of spirit leaves marks like that, old man?" Hemlock merely looked at Bart then, a long assessing gaze that seemed to strip away the man's bravado, leaving only the raw fear underneath. He said nothing more, but the silence after his words felt heavier than before. The silences themselves became the worst. They weren't the quiet of a resting mine. They were absolute. All sound, even the drip of water from the rock, would cease. The mountain itself seemed to hold its breath. It was a predatory silence, the kind that settles before a strike. In those moments, you could feel the blood thrumming behind your ears, could hear the frantic beat of your own heart, and knew that something was close, something that commanded the very air, that swallowed sound. And when the sounds returned, it was with a jolt, a sudden clang or drip that made your nerves jump. Bart Crumpler was falling apart. His muttering had turned to frantic whispers, his eyes darting into every shadow. He saw things. He swore he saw a flicker of movement at the edge of his lamp's light, a pale shape that vanished when he turned his head directly. We all saw things in the dancing shadows. We were tired. But Bart's fear was different. It was a tangible thing, a stench of its own, polluting the air around him. He started refusing to go into certain passages alone, even short distances. He'd jump at every creak of the timbers, every shift of rock. His lamp shook almost constantly, casting wild, erratic shadows that only amplified his terror. "It's watching us," he'd mutter to himself, or to anyone who would listen. "I feel its eyes, cold, like dead things." Silas tried to calm him. "It's the strain, Bart. Too much time in the dark." But even Silas's voice lacked conviction now. He was seeing the marks, feeling the cold, smelling the sour air. He was hearing the silences. He just didn't have a name for it. He didn't want one. One evening after the day's blasting, a rock fall had narrowed a section of the main tunnel, forcing us to clear it before we could bring out the ore carts. It was tedious, dangerous work. We were all soaked in sweat, breathing heavy. Tommy and I were working side by side, chipping away at a particularly stubborn piece of granite. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. His drill lay silent beside him. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, worn soft at the creases. It was a sketch, a simple drawing of a small house with a garden. "For my mother," he said, his voice soft, almost lost in the mind's hum. "Once we strike it big, she always wanted roses. A proper garden, not just the dust of the city." I nodded, not looking at him, but at the lamp on the wall, its light doing little to fight the gloom that seemed to press in from all sides. "Good plan, Tommy." "You got family, Jake?" "A sister," I said, "up in Carson City, runs a boarding house, always busy." The image of her bustling kitchen, full of light and noise, felt 1,000 miles away on another planet. The sour smell was back, faint, but there, even in the relative openness of the main tunnel, it seemed to cling to the very air. Tommy folded the sketch carefully, tucking it back into his pocket. "This king's vein," he said, a hopeful glint in his young eyes. "Silas says it'll be enough for everyone, enough to go home." I just grunted, hefting my pick. We all wanted to go home. We all wanted to believe. But the mountain had begun to feel less like a promise and more like a trap. Bart's fear reached a crescendo 2 days later. He had been assigned to a solitary section, shoring up some timbers near an old, unused shaft that led deeper into the unmapped recesses of the Lode. The shaft was choked with debris, but it was a place where Silas wanted timbering reinforced just in case. Bart had argued, pleaded, but Silas, still trying to maintain order and dismiss the unseen, had insisted. "You're a miner, Bart," Silas had said, his voice hard. "You do your job." Hours later, the rest of us were still working the main vein. We heard a scream, not a shout, a raw, guttural scream of pure terror that ripped through the mine, echoing off the rock walls, then abruptly cut short. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard. It froze us all. Every pickaxe stopped, every breath caught. We stood in absolute silence, straining to hear nothing. Just the fading echoes of that scream. Silas was the first to move, grabbing his lamp and his rifle. "Bart!" he yelled, his voice hoarse. "Bart, answer me!" Only silence. The terrible, devouring silence. "Come on!" Silas barked. And we followed, our lamps bobbing, our hearts hammering. We found his section. The timbers he was supposed to be shoring up were untouched. His tools lay scattered on the ground. His lamp was still burning, lying on its side, casting a sickly yellow glow on the surrounding rock. And there near the mouth of the old, choked shaft was Bart. He was not merely dead. He was grotesquely twisted. His body was contorted into an impossible shape. Limbs bent at angles that no human frame could achieve. His head was turned, completely backward, his mouth agape in a silent, horrifying scream, his eyes wide and vacant, reflecting the single flickering lamp. His skin was pale, almost translucent, as if all the blood had been drained from him. But there was no blood on the floor, no struggle marks, just Bart, impossibly broken. And on the rock wall just above him, at least 10 feet high, were fresh gouges, not faint scratches. These were deep, raw wounds in the granite, as if something with immense, sharp claws had scraped upwards, then across. They looked like a child's drawing of a hand, but monstrous in scale, and from the mouth of the choked shaft an unnatural cold gusted out, carrying with it that sickening, metallic, sour smell. It was stronger now, a pervasive reek of decay, and something utterly alien. No one spoke. We just stood there, our lamps illuminating the horror, the terrible understanding slowly dawning on us. It wasn't rockfall, it wasn't the strain, it wasn't old spirits. It was something real, something that had taken Bart, something that had moved with impossible speed and strength without making a sound, leaving him like a broken doll. And it was still down here, with us. Silas stood over Bart, his face a mask of grim realization. The rifle in his hand seemed useless. He looked at the gouges, then back at Bart's twisted form. His eyes, usually so sharp and pragmatic, now held a deep, profound terror. The king's vein, the promise of fortune, was gone from his mind, replaced by an undeniable truth. We were not alone in this mountain, and the thing that shared its depths was a hunter, and we, the miners, were its prey. The mystery was over. The whispers had turned to screams. We understood now, and that understanding was far more terrifying than any ghost story. We were trapped, deep within the earth, with a creature that defied every known law of nature, a creature that had just shown us what it could do. The fear was no longer Bart's alone. It was ours, and it was bone deep. The silence that followed Bart's scream after we found him was deeper than any before. It was a silence that filled the tunnels, pressing in on our ears, swallowing the sound of our own ragged breaths. Our lamps, usually sources of comfort, now seemed only to carve out small, fragile islands of light in an ocean of malevolent dark. We knew. We all knew. And the knowledge was a suffocating weight. Silas, after a long moment, finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. We move. There was no plan yet, just the instinct to get away from the horror, away from the mouth of that choked shaft. We left Bart where he lay. There was nothing to be done for him, no way to move him, no time to spare. The gouges on the rock, a testament to impossible strength, burned themselves into our minds. We turned our backs, our lamps swinging wildly as we stumbled away, our eyes darting into every shadow. The retreat was not a simple matter of walking back the way we came. The tunnels, which had once felt like a path to riches, now felt like a living, breathing labyrinth designed to confuse and ensnare. We had only taken a few dozen paces when Silas halted, holding up a hand. "Listen," he murmured. We listened. The usual drip of water, the distant groan of settling rock, the faint hum of the mountain. But beneath it, something else. A faint scraping. Not the sound of a pickaxe, not even a natural shift. This was deliberate, and it was coming from ahead. Silas cursed under his breath. We had been moving towards the main shaft, the only way out, but now that path seemed to be blocked, or watched. We couldn't tell. The scraping was intermittent, shifting. It sounded like something large, heavy, but moving with unnatural stealth, dragging itself across the uneven floor, or perhaps along the ceiling. "It's heading us off," Old Man Hemlock said, his voice raspy, confirming what we all feared. His eyes held a terrible, knowing glint. "It knows." these tunnels better than we do. We tried another route, a narrower side passage that eventually led back to the main artery, or so we hoped. The air grew colder here, the sour smell thickening until it was a constant cloying presence in our throats. The walls felt closer, the ceiling lower. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe, playing tricks on our exhausted eyes. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak. We had been working for days, pushing deep, barely sleeping. Now fear amplified every ache, every tremor. Our water skins were running low, and the scant rations of hardtack and dried meat felt like sawdust in our mouths. Time lost all meaning in the constant dark, broken only by the flickering lamps. We moved in a desperate, shuffling procession, Silas in the lead, rifle held ready, Jeb and Cal flanking, Tommy close behind me, and Hemlock bringing up the rear, his old eyes sweeping the darkness. Glimpses started. Not full views, not yet, but undeniable flashes that made our blood run cold. A pale limb, unnaturally long and thin, would whip across the edge of our lamplight, disappearing before we could truly focus. A shadow too fast, too angular would flit across the ceiling above us, moving with a fluid, spider-like grace that defied gravity. Sometimes we'd catch a brief, reflective gleam in the absolute blackness of a side passage, like a pair of hollow eyes watching us. It never stayed. It was always gone. A phantom in the periphery, leaving only the chilling certainty that it was there, always. One such glimpse came in a small cavern we were forced to cross. The ceiling here was high, the space larger than most passages, offering a brief, terrifying illusion of openness. Our lamps cast long, dancing shadows. As Silas led us across, I glanced back, my lamp sweeping the rock face, and there, pressed impossibly high into a narrow crevice where the rock met the ceiling, was a form. Pale, elongated. It seemed to fold itself, a mass of impossibly bent limbs, its translucent white skin almost blending with the quartz-veined rock. Its head was low, nestled between two massive shoulders, but I saw the eyes. They were hollow, reflective, like polished obsidian, fixed on us with an unnerving, calculating intelligence. It was watching, waiting. It didn't move, not then, just watched. I stopped, my breath catching. "Silas!" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He turned, his lamp following my gaze. For a split second he saw it too. The pale, folded form, the reflective eyes. Then, with a sickening ripple of movement, it simply wasn't there. It had vanished, not run, not dropped, but simply unfolded itself into the deeper shadows, too fast for the eye to follow. Silas swore, a low, guttural sound of pure terror and frustration. "Keep moving," he barked, his voice tight. "Don't stop." The Rake, as we had begun to call it, didn't just stalk us, it manipulated the mine itself. We found passages we had used before now blocked with fresh rockfalls too large to clear quickly. Timbers, meticulously placed, were inexplicably torn down, making certain sections treacherous. It was like a cruel game, a predator herding its prey. It knew our roots. It knew our weaknesses. It was smarter than any beast. Cal, usually quick with a sarcastic remark, was silent, his face drawn and pale beneath the grime. Tommy, his earlier enthusiasm long gone, walked like a ghost, his eyes wide and vacant, occasionally muttering to himself about his mother's roses. He clutched the folded sketch in his hand now, no longer bothering to keep it in his pocket. It was his last anchor to a world that felt impossibly far away. "It's playing with us," Cal rasped one time, after we'd hit another dead end, forced to backtrack through a section we knew was watched, like a cat with a mouse. Silas just nodded, his jaw set. He was making decisions quickly, instinctively abandoning any thought of silver, focused only on survival. He sacrificed a pickaxe we could ill afford to lose, jamming it into a crevice to pry open a stubborn seam, creating a new tight passage we could squeeze through. Every turn was a gamble, every shadow a potential ambush. The incident with Jeb happened in a long, narrow tunnel, one we thought was leading us towards a ventilation shaft, a potential way out. We were strung out, single file, our lamps casting a meager light on the uneven floor. Jeb was directly behind Silas, his large frame a reassuring presence. I was behind Jeb, with Tommy and Cal behind me and Hemlock at the rear. The air grew intensely cold, colder than any spot we had encountered before. It carried that potent, metallic reek. We all felt it. The sudden, sharp drop in temperature. It was a warning, a premonition. Silas stopped, raising his lamp, sweeping it slowly around the passage. "Hold up," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Something's not right." There was no sound, just the silence, the terrible, devouring silence. It was so absolute, it felt like the mine itself was holding its breath. Then it struck. From a narrow crack in the wall, too small to be anything but a fissure, a pale, elongated arm shot out. It moved with impossible speed, a blur of white against the dark rock. The hand, unnaturally large, with fingers like railroad spikes, clamped onto Jeb's leg. Jeb didn't even have time to scream a full word. It was a choked, gurgling sound, a gasp of pure horror. He was pulled, violently. The lamp in his hand dropped, shattering on the rock floor, plunging that section of the tunnel into absolute, suffocating blackness. We heard the scrape of his heavy boots against the rock as he was dragged, heard his choked cries, a desperate animal sound of terror and pain fading rapidly into the depths of the fissure. "Jeb!" Silas roared, bringing up his rifle, but there was nothing to shoot at. Just the crack and the last fading echo of Jeb's struggle. The darkness where Jeb had been swallowed felt like a gaping maw. It was absolute, palpable. We stood frozen, lamps shaking, our eyes wide with the fresh horror. Another one gone. Another, taken in a flash of unnatural speed and power. And again, no sound from the creature itself, just the silent, efficient snatch. Cal let out a low, whimpering sound, a sound I hadn't thought him capable of. Tommy began to sob, silent tears cutting trails through the dust on his face, clutching his mother's drawing. Silas, his face a mask of grim fury, lowered his rifle. There was no rescue to be made, no fight to be had, just escape. "Move!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "Now! Get back! Back!" We scrambled, turning and stumbling over ourselves, abandoning the promised ventilation shaft, retreating blindly from the horror we had just witnessed. Our minds screamed. The Rake was not just following us, it was here. It was everywhere. It could appear from anywhere. The tunnels became a maze of terror. Every turn was a decision that might lead us to salvation or to another ambush. Silas, with a grim determination that bordered on madness, began making truly impossible choices. We found a section where a small, rickety ore cart sat on rusted tracks. It was heavy, useless for escape. But Silas saw something else. "We'll use it," he said, his eyes scanning the tunnel ahead, then the ceiling. "We'll block this passage." He instructed us to pile rocks into the cart, then to jam it into a narrow bend, using what little dynamite we had left to seal the passage behind us. It was a desperate measure, sacrificing one potential escape route to buy a few hours, a few minutes of peace from the relentless pursuit. The explosion was deafening, the rock fall immediate, a controlled chaos that sent dust and debris flying. When the dust settled, the passage was sealed, but we knew it was only temporary. The Rake could find a way around or through eventually. The dread was constant. It was a physical thing, a knot in our stomachs, a tightness in our chests. We spoke in whispers, if we spoke at all. Every creak of the mountain, every drip of water sent shivers down our spines. Our lamps once our only comfort, now felt like beacons advertising our presence, drawing the thing closer. We moved through passages we had barely charted, following Hemlock's increasingly urgent, cryptic directions, his old prospector's intuition now our only guide. He seemed to feel the creature's presence, to sense its movements, even without seeing it. "It's circling," he'd murmur, his eyes distant. "Always circling, closing in." The Rake always seemed to know where we were. We would take a turn, thinking we had gained some distance, only to hear the faint scraping again just behind us, or sometimes chillingly ahead. It never rushed. It never made a mistake. Its predatory intelligence was cold, precise, and utterly terrifying. We were being toyed with, driven further and further into the heart of the mountain, deeper into its dark embrace. Every breath was a struggle, every step an agony. We were dwindling, our numbers falling, our hope fading like the last embers of a dying fire. The mountain was no longer just hostile. It was alive, and it was hunting us. The mountain was no longer just hostile. It was alive, and it was hunting us. We had been driven into a deep, vast chamber, an ancient maw in the earth that Silas had hoped might lead to the legendary vein, but which now felt like a final, inescapable trap. The air here was heavy, thick with the metallic reek that had become so sickeningly familiar. Our lamps, low on oil, cast long, wavering shadows that danced like specters on the rough-hewn walls. There was no other way out. The passages we had used to enter were too narrow, too winding, and we could hear the faint, sickening scrape of the Rake's movement, a sound that seemed to come from every direction at once, echoing off the rock. Cal leaned against a damp wall, his eyes wide and unfocused. Tommy sat on the dusty floor, his head in his hands, the crumpled drawing of his mother's house clutched tight. Silas stood in the center, his rifle still in his hands, but his stance was not one of defiance, but of grim, terrible realization. His gaze swept around the chamber, then settled on the single massive opening that formed the only exit. It was perhaps 20 feet across, a gaping mouth of darkness leading into what we could only assume were the creature's own tunnels. The scraping stopped. The silence returned, deeper, more profound than ever. It was the silence of a predator that knows its prey is cornered. Then it appeared, not in a flash, not in a blur, but slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. It unfolded itself from the shadows of the main passage, its immense pale body emerging into the meager light of our lamps. It was larger than I had imagined, larger than the fleeting glimpses had suggested, easily 8 feet long when fully extended, perhaps more. Its translucent white skin seemed to absorb the light, making it glow with an unnatural, sickly luminescence. Its limbs were elongated, bent at impossible angles, spider-like, propelling it forward with a terrible, fluid grace that defied its size. The hands, unnaturally large, ended in fingers like railroad spikes, each tipped with a dark, glistening point. Its head was small, almost insignificant compared to its body, but the eyes, those were what held me. They were hollow, reflective, like dark, polished obsidian, mirroring the tiny flames of our lamps back at us. They held no warmth, no malice, no emotion I could comprehend, only an unnerving, calculating intelligence, and the mouth. It was a wide, silent line across its face, a dark slit that promised an unnatural capacity for horror. It stopped, perhaps 30 feet from us, its limbs splayed against the rock, its body folded into a grotesque, waiting posture. It watched us. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It simply existed, a living nightmare blocking our only way out. Cal whimpered again, a low, guttural sound. Tommy was shaking uncontrollably, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I felt a cold dread settle in my gut, heavier than any rockfall. There was no escape, not from this. Silas, however, did not flinch. His eyes, though filled with a terrible understanding, held a different kind of resolve. He lowered his rifle, not in surrender, but in a final awful decision. He looked at the rake, then back at us. "There's no fighting it," he said, his voice flat, devoid of his usual command, yet carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Not this thing." He walked towards a section of the chamber wall near where we had stored some of our remaining blasting powder and a few sticks of dynamite, remnants of the day's work. It was a deep fissure, one that ran vertically for a good 30 feet, a natural fault line in the rock. His eyes scanned it, then the ceiling above. "It can't. Come to the surface," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "Not ever." He turned to me, his gaze clear. "Jake, you, Tommy, Cal, there's a small shaft. Just behind that stack of timbers, see it?" He pointed with his chin. "Tight squeeze. Leads up back towards the main artery, might still be clear." My eyes followed his direction. There was a narrow opening, half obscured by stacked lumber, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. A desperate, impossible hope flickered within me. "But Silas," I began, the words catching in my throat. He cut me off. "No time. Listen, when I give the signal, you go. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just go." He picked up a handful of dynamite sticks, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "There's enough here to bring it all down. Seal it." My blood ran cold. He meant to bring the mountain down on the rake and on himself. "Silas, no," Cal cried, finding his voice raw with terror and disbelief. "You can't!" Silas ignored him, his grim eyes fixed on the rake, which still waited, silent, watching, as if it understood. "This thing, it's not a beast. It's too smart, too patient. It'll follow us, all the way up, to the light." His voice was heavy with the awful truth. "This is the only way." He began to set the charges methodically, expertly along the deep fissure in the wall. He worked quickly, his movements precise, almost serene, in the face of the unspeakable horror before us. The rake remained still, its reflective eyes following Silas's every move, an unnerving, silent witness to the foreman's desperate preparations. "Tommy," Silas said without looking up, "your mother. You tell her I said you were a good boy, a good miner." Tommy could only sob, shaking his head, tears streaming down his face. "Cal," Silas continued, "keep them moving. Make sure they get out." Cal nodded, his face a mixture of terror and a dawning, awful respect. He moved towards Tommy, pulling him gently to his feet, guiding him towards the narrow shaft. "Jake," Silas said, finally looking at me, his eyes holding a depth of sorrow and resolve I had never seen. "You tell them what happened down here. The truth. Not the lies they'll want to believe." I could only nod, my throat tight, unable to speak. The rake twitched a finger, a slow, deliberate movement. It seemed to be waiting for Silas to finish. Silas finished setting the last charge. He lit the fuse, a short, sputtering wick that began to burn with alarming speed. The small orange flame was the only movement in the entire horrifying tableau. "Go!" Silas bellowed, his voice raw, stronger than I thought possible. "Now! Get out!" Cal grabbed Tommy, pulling him towards the narrow opening. I hesitated, my eyes fixed on Silas, on the burning fuse. He met my gaze, a ghost of a smile on his dust-caked face. He raised his hand, a final silent farewell. "Go, Jake!" he roared again, his voice echoing, mingling with the hiss of the fuse. Turned and scrambled into the small opening, pushing past Cal and Tommy. It was a tight squeeze, the rock pressing in on all sides, dust filling my mouth and lungs. Cal followed, then Tommy, whimpering as he squeezed through. We crawled, blindly, desperately, as the hiss grew louder, faster. Then came the roar. It wasn't just an explosion. It was the sound of the mountain tearing itself apart. The ground beneath us bucked violently, throwing us against the rock. Dust and small stones rained down, blinding us, choking us. The air was filled with the deafening groan of collapsing rock, a sound that vibrated through my very bones. I could feel the earth shifting, collapsing behind us, the ground shuddering with a terrible seismic force. "Keep moving!" Cal yelled, his voice strained, urgent. "Don't stop!" We crawled on, driven by the primal fear, by the sound of the world ending behind us. The passage narrowed further, then widened slightly, then narrowed again. It felt like an eternity, but it could only have been minutes. The noise of the cave-in slowly began to recede, replaced by the ringing in my ears, by the frantic beat of my own heart. We scrambled, clawed, pushed, until a faint, almost imperceptible gray light appeared ahead. Not the deep black of the mine, but a lighter shade of dark. Hope surged, a desperate, raw thing. We pushed harder, our bodies screaming in protest. Then, with a final agonizing effort, I burst out. The sun hit me like a physical blow, blinding, searing. I collapsed onto the hot red earth of the Nevada desert, gasping, coughing, my lungs burning, my eyes stinging. Dust and grime covered me, a thick mask that the sunlight seemed to bake onto my skin. Behind me, Cal and Tommy followed, dragging themselves out of the small, debris-choked opening. Cal was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, his face streaked with tears and dirt. Tommy lay still, curled in a ball, his body racked with silent sobs. The mine entrance, gaping wound in the earth, was silent now. A plume of dust still rose from the depths, a monument to the devastation below. The mountain had sealed itself. Silas had done it. He had entombed the Rake and himself. We sat there for a long time, not speaking, not moving, just breathing the harsh, dry air, letting the sun beat down on us. The silence above ground was a different kind of terrible, a vast, empty silence that mocked the horrors we had just escaped. When we finally made it back to Virginia City, a small, grim procession, our accounts were met with disbelief. Mining officials, clean-shaven men in suits, listened with polite skepticism. They nodded, they took notes, but their eyes held no understanding. The official explanation was swift and simple: a natural fault line, a geological instability exacerbated by deep excavation, a tragic accident. Silas Malone, a brave foreman lost in the line of duty. Jeb Finch, Bart Crumpler, and others victims of the unforgiving earth. They spoke of the dangers of the Comstock, the inherent risks. They spoke of everything but the Rake. No one wanted to hear about a pale, silent creature with reflective eyes and railroad spike fingers. They dismissed our tales as the ravings of men driven mad by the darkness, by the bad air, by the trauma of a terrible cave-in. They saw our gaunt faces, our haunted eyes, our physical wounds, and they offered pity, not belief. Cal left the Comstock Lode within the week, never to return. He went east, they said, back to some quiet farm away from the mountains. He never spoke of what happened, not to anyone, not ever. Tommy, the young boy with dreams of roses, never quite recovered. He wandered the streets of Carson City for a time, his eyes still wide and vacant, muttering about the dark. The last I heard, he had been sent to an asylum, a quiet place where the whispers of the mountain couldn't reach him. His mother never got her house, never got her roses. I stayed. The Comstocks was in my blood, or perhaps the mountain simply wouldn't let me go. I worked smaller claims, shallower shafts, always with an eye to the darkness, always listening. The scars on my body faded, but the ones inside never did. The Rake's reflective eyes were etched into my memory, a permanent fixture in the landscape of my mind. Years passed. The boom faded. The great mines dwindled, their silver veins exhausted. The Comstock Lode became a ghost of its former self, its deep tunnels abandoned, slowly collapsing in on themselves. But the stories endured. Whispers circulated among the old-timers, the few who had seen too much, of a chill that could descend in the deepest parts of old shafts, even in the height of summer, of a faint, metallic smell that sometimes drifted up from forgotten passages, and the marks. Sometimes in an old, unstable tunnel, one that had been sealed for decades, a timber would shift, a rock would fall, revealing a section of wall that had been hidden, and there, stark against the ancient stone, would be the gouges. Deep, impossibly high claw marks, too large for any man, too deliberate for any natural force, the kind of marks that could only be made by fingers like railroad spikes. They say the mountain breathes, they say the earth shifts, but I knew, we knew. Silas's sacrifice had sealed the Rake, but the mountain was vast, its depths unknowable. It was a patient creature, permanent, waiting. The earth would yield again eventually, and the Rake would be there, always, waiting for its next feast. I saw the signs even now in my old age when my hands trembled and my eyes were dim. The darkness still held its secret, and sometimes in the dead of night I still smelled that cold, metallic odor, and I knew it was still down there, sleeping, waiting.